Hey guys, tonight we're feeding a Templar Knight. This is a warrior monk who took vows of poverty, obedience, and fun prevention, then sat down every day to eat meals specifically designed to kill joy. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment, like the video, and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're retuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Feeding a Templar Knight was not dining. It was not a meal. It was a logistical procedure performed to prevent collapse. Think less banquet and more human maintenance window. The goal was simple. Keep the knight alive, upright, and capable of wearing an unreasonable amount of metal without passing out. The Templar did not eat for pleasure. Pleasure was suspicious. Pleasure led to smiling, and smiling often led to questions. Questions led to discussions, and discussions led to disobedience. The safest path was to eat something bland, not internally, and move on with your day. The Knights Templar were warrior monks, which meant they took the least fun parts of monastic life and combined them with the most exhausting parts of warfare. From monks, they inherited discipline, silence, and a deep mistrust of enjoyment. From soldiers, they inherited the need for calories, strength, and the ability to march long distances while pretending they were fine. As a result, their meals lived in a narrow emotional zone, filling, repetitive, and spiritually humbling. If food could be described as interesting, someone had already made a mistake. A Templar did not browse menus. He did not ask for recommendations. He did not say things like, "I'm not really feeling lentils today." What he received was what everyone received, and what everyone received was chosen precisely because no one would get excited about it. Excitement was dangerous. Excitement led to attachment. Attachment led to longing. Longing led to distraction. Distraction led to thinking about things other than duty, God, and not dying violently. None of that was acceptable. Meals were deliberately structured to avoid indulgence. Portions were sufficient, but uninspiring. Ingredients were practical, durable, and emotionally neutral. Spices existed, but only just enough to remind you they could have used more spices. Even the act of eating followed strict expectations. No rushing, no lingering, no dramatic reactions. You chewed, you swallowed, you reflected silently on obedience. If you enjoyed the meal too much, you kept that information to yourself. In modern terms, feeding a Templar Knight was less like dinner and more like refueling a siege engine that occasionally prayed. Calories mattered, consistency mattered, personal happiness did not. The result was a diet that kept bodies strong, minds focused, and morale safely low enough to prevent dangerous thoughts like, "What if life could be nicer?" Comfort was not the goal. Survival was, and survival, according to the Templars, tasted exactly like this. If you imagined a group of armored knights sitting around a table, laughing, talking, and bonding over dinner, let's correct that immediately. A Templar dining hall was not lively, it was not social. It was not warm in the emotional sense. It was quiet enough that you could hear bread being broken and souls being reshaped. Templars ate their meals in near total silence, not because they were antisocial, but because silence was part of the discipline. Talking encouraged personality. Personality encouraged individuality. Individuality was a slippery slope that ended with opinions, preferences, and eventually someone asking why dinner always tasted like regret. So, instead of conversation, meals were accompanied by readings. Scripture, rules of the order, or moral instructions were read aloud while everyone ate. Nothing compliments chewing dense bread quite like being reminded of obedience, humility, and your many spiritual shortcomings. If you wanted to comment on the food, you did not. If you wanted to ask for the salt, you did not. If you wanted to complain that the soup tasted like boiled despair, you definitely did not. Silence wasn't just expected, it was enforced by social pressure and the quiet judgment of everyone else at the table. The dining hall itself reinforced this atmosphere. Long wooden tables, hard benches, no cushions, no personal space. You sat shoulder to shoulder with other knights, all eating the same food at the same pace, all pretending not to notice each other. It was equality, but make it uncomfortable. Eye contact was minimal. Lingering looks suggested distraction. Distraction suggested temptation. Temptation suggested weakness. Weakness suggested paperwork. Nobody wanted paperwork. Even chewing was meant to be restrained. Loud eating drew attention. Attention drew correction. Correction drew embarrassment. The safest approach was slow, careful chewing, eyes down, thoughts politely directed away from hunger and toward discipline. And yet within this silence, the Templars found order. The lack of conversation stripped meals of distraction. Eating became mechanical, predictable, efficient, exactly how the order liked it. In modern terms, this was less family dinner and more spiritual assembly line. Food went in, energy came out, character was molded somewhere in between. Silence ensured that no one lingered at the table for pleasure. You ate, you listened, you finished. Then you stood up and returned to duty, slightly less hungry and slightly more obedient than before. Because in the Templar world, even meals were training. Training in restraint, training in focus, training in the noble art of not speaking when you absolutely wanted to. If the Templar diet had a hero, it was not meat, wine, or anything remotely exciting. It was bread, relentless, dependable, joyless bread. Bread wasn't a side dish, it was the foundation upon which every meal, every day, and arguably every Templar jaw was built. This was not soft bread. This was not bakery bread. This was not tear it apart with your hands and smile bread. This was dense, dark, coarse bread made from barley or mixed grains. Bread with ambition. Bread that resisted being eaten. Bread that required commitment. A Templar did not casually snack on bread. He engaged with it. Chewing was an activity. Over time, a knight's jaw became stronger, not from battle, but from repeatedly negotiating with bread that refused to cooperate. Fresh bread was appreciated quietly and internally. Stale bread was normal. Rock-hard bread was expected. When bread reached the stage where it could reasonably be used to repair a wall, it was not discarded. It was soaked in broth and eaten anyway. Waste was sinful. Hunger was instructional. Bread was present at every meal because it solved several problems at once. It filled the stomach. It stored well. It traveled well. It asked nothing of you emotionally. You could march for hours on bread alone, provided you accepted that joy was no longer part of the arrangement. It also reinforced discipline. Bread was the same every day, predictable, reliable. If you started longing for variety, that was your problem, not the bread's. The bread was doing its job. Even the act of breaking bread was controlled. No tearing off giant chunks, no hoarding. Portions were regulated so everyone received the same amount. Equality through carbohydrate distribution, and bread did more than feed. It absorbed soups, stews, and sauces, transforming thin liquids into something approaching a meal. In this way, bread was not just food. It was a tool, a sponge, a coping mechanism. There was no ceremony around it, no praise, no reflection on flavor. Bread existed, and therefore you ate it. In modern terms, bread was the Templar's protein bar, bland, efficient, and consumed with the understanding that it was not here to make you happy. If a Templar ever dreamed of food, it was probably bread. If he ever complained about food, it was silently to himself while chewing. And if he ever thought, surely there must be more to life than this, the bread was there to remind him, no, there is not. At this point, you might be wondering when the Templars finally got to the good part. The roasted meats, the dripping fat, the heroic chewing. This is where expectations quietly sit down and rethink their life choices. Yes, Templar Knights ate meat. No, it was not a daily celebration. Meat was regulated, scheduled, and stripped of all drama. It appeared on specific days, approved by the rules, and prepared in ways that removed any trace of excitement. If you were hoping for a medieval barbecue, you joined the wrong order. When meat arrived, it usually came boiled or stewed, not roasted, not seasoned aggressively, not displayed proudly. Boiled, this method had many advantages. It softened tough cuts, stretched portions, and eliminated anything resembling indulgence. It also ensured that meat tasted exactly like what the Templars wanted it to taste like, nourishment with no emotional attachment. The most common meats were beef and mutton. Pork existed, but it was not a favorite, partly because it was fatty, partly because it made people too happy, and partly because someone somewhere always suspected pork of encouraging moral weakness. Poultry showed up occasionally, but never with ceremony. Chickens were eaten with the same enthusiasm one might show toward filing paperwork. Portions were controlled. You were not eating until you were full. You were eating until you were no longer hungry enough to complain internally. Overeating was discouraged. Gluttony was a sin. Enjoyment beyond a certain threshold was suspicious. And no, rank did not earn you more meat. A knight did not receive a larger portion than a sergeant. Equality at the table reinforced obedience elsewhere. If you thought your battlefield bravery earned you an extra piece, the answer was no. And the silence around that no was very firm. Meat was seen as strengthening, but also dangerous. Too much meat led to excess energy. Excess energy led to restlessness. Restlessness led to thoughts. Thoughts led to questioning why life involved so much boiled food. The safest amount of meat was just enough to function. In modern terms, meat in a Templar diet was treated like a controlled substance. Approved, limited, carefully monitored. You got it because your body needed it, not because you wanted it. So, yes, Templars ate meat, but they ate it the way they did everything else, without flair, without joy, and without letting it get any ideas. Just when a Templar Knight might start thinking, yes, meet again. Life is improving. The calendar quietly intervened. Enter the fasting days, and there were many. On those days, meat vanished completely, replaced by fish, because nothing says spiritual discipline like eating something that smells faintly offended by existence. Fish days were not rare exceptions. They were a regular feature of Templar life, showing up weekly and during long stretches of the religious year. The purpose was simple: restraint. Meat was considered rich, fish was considered humble, and humility, like bread and silence, was something the order felt you could never have too much of. This was not fresh, glistening ocean table fish. This was medieval fish, salted fish, dried fish, smoked fish, fish that had traveled long distances and had plenty of time to reflect on its fate. By the time it reached the table, it was less a meal and more a lesson. Salted fish was especially common. It preserved well, traveled easily, and lasted forever, possibly longer than the night eating it. The downside was that it tasted exactly like what it was: fish that had been aggressively introduced to salt and then left alone with its thoughts. Cooking methods did not improve matters. Fish was usually boiled or stewed, sometimes mixed with vegetables, sometimes served plainly, always served without apology. Spices were used sparingly, as too much flavor might accidentally make the meal enjoyable, and that was not the objective. Fish meals reinforced obedience. You ate fish not because you liked it, but because the rules said so. Complaining would have achieved nothing except internal disappointment. The proper response was quiet acceptance and slow chewing. Interestingly, fish days also served a practical purpose. They gave the body a break from heavy meats and stretched resources in regions where meat was expensive or scarce. Spiritually humbling and economically efficient, a combination the Templars deeply appreciated. In modern terms, fish days were like mandatory wellness meals imposed by someone who did not care whether you enjoyed them: nutritious, sensible, deeply unexciting. And yet fish kept Templars alive, functional and obedient, which from the order's perspective meant it was doing an excellent job. So, when fish appeared on the table, no one celebrated, no one complained. They simply ate, knowing that tomorrow might bring meat again or more fish. If bread was the foundation of a Templar's diet, and fish was the test of obedience, then vegetables were the unsung laborers quietly holding the entire system together. They were not glamorous, they were not celebrated. They were simply there always, waiting patiently in bowls, stews, and pots, doing the nutritional work no one else wanted credit for. Templar vegetables were not chosen for flavor. They were chosen because they grew easily, stored well, and did not encourage emotional attachment. Onions, leeks, cabbage, beans, lentils, peas, vegetables that understood their role in life and did not aspire to greatness. Onions appeared constantly, they were cheap, durable, and capable of making otherwise bland food feel like it had briefly considered personality. Leeks were popular, too, especially in stews where they dissolved into the background like obedient monks of the vegetable world. Cabbage showed up whenever someone remembered to grow it, and when it did, it stayed for a long time, both in storage and in memory. Legumes did most of the real work. Lentils and beans were filling, protein-rich, and deeply committed to being boiled until all individuality was removed. A pot of lentils could feed many nights, last several meals, and ask nothing in return except patience and low expectations. Vegetables also served an important moral purpose. They were humble, plain, earthbound. Eating them reinforced the idea that pleasure was optional and restraint was virtuous. No one ever looked at a bowl of boiled cabbage and felt tempted toward excess. Mission accomplished. Preparation was simple. Vegetables were chopped, tossed into a pot, boiled, and occasionally seasoned with salt. Herbs existed, but they were used cautiously, as if flavor itself might lead to sign. The result was food that filled the stomach without exciting the mind. And yet, these vegetables kept Templars functioning. They provided energy for training, digestion that did not rebel, and meals that could be eaten day after day without logistical complications. In a life built on routine, vegetables fit perfectly. In modern terms, vegetables were the Templar equivalent of meal prep. Reliable, predictable, nutritionally responsible, emotionally absent. No one praised them. No one missed them when they were gone. But without vegetables, the entire system would have quietly collapsed, which honestly is exactly how the Templars like things to work. If there was one culinary achievement the Templars truly mastered, it was soup. Not because they loved it, but because soup was the logical endpoint of their entire worldview. Soup was efficient. Soup was obedient. Soup asked no questions and required no enthusiasm. When in doubt, everything went into a pot, bread too hard to chew. Soup. Vegetables looking tired. Soup. Meat too tough to pretend you enjoyed. Soup. Fish that had traveled across 3 regions and lost all hope. Definitely soup. Soup solved problems quietly, which made it the perfect food for an order that preferred quiet solutions. Most Templar soups were thick stews rather than light broths. Thin soup suggested scarcity. Thick soup suggested control. A proper stew could be ladled, stretched, reheated, and served again tomorrow with minimal effort and zero emotional investment. If a pot lasted several days, that was not laziness. That was efficiency. Soup also served a structural purpose. Remember the bread. The jaw-breaking, enthusiasm-crushing bread. Soup softened it. Knights dunked their bread into the pot, letting it absorb liquid until it became chewable again. In this way, soup functioned less like a dish and more like a repair tool. The contents of a template stew depended on the day. Lentils, beans, onions, cabbage, leeks, bits of meat, sometimes fish, sometimes all of the above. Once ingredients entered the pot, individuality ceased to exist. Everything became stew. Differences were erased. Equality was achieved. Spices were minimal. Salt was standard. Herbs appeared occasionally, just enough to remind everyone that flavor was theoretically possible, but not encouraged. A stew that tasted too good raised concerns. A stew that tasted acceptable meant it was doing its job. Soup was also practical during campaigns. Large pots could feed many men quickly. It required no fancy equipment, no precise timing, and no personal preference. You ate what you were given at the pace dictated by the ladle. In modern terms, soup was the Templar version of bulk cooking. Meal prep for men who believed joy was a distraction. No one praised the soup. No one complained about the soup. It existed, it warmed, it filled, and in the Templar worldview, that was perfection. If you could build a religion around a food, soup would have been a strong candidate. If you're wondering whether a hungry Templar could simply help himself to more food, the answer is no, and not a soft no, a very firm institutional no. Portion control was not a suggestion, it was policy. Eating was regulated with the same seriousness as prayer schedules and battlefield discipline. A Templar did not eat until he was full. He ate until he was no longer distracted by hunger. There is a difference. Fullness encouraged relaxation. Relaxation encouraged comfort. Comfort once again was suspicious. Meals were portioned evenly so that every man received the same amount. Equality at the table mattered deeply. If one knight received more, resentment followed. Resentment led to thoughts. Thoughts led to problems. The safest approach was identical bowls, identical portions, and identical disappointment. Second helpings were rare and required permission. You did not simply reach forward and refill your bowl like you were at a village feast. Doing so would have drawn attention, and attention was never helpful. Attention suggested desire. Desire suggested excess. Excess suggested weakness. And weakness in the Templar world was a liability. This system also reinforced self-control. You learned to pace yourself. Eat too quickly and you were left staring at an empty bowl while others continued chewing in silence. Eat too slowly, and the meal ended anyway. Timing mattered. Discipline mattered. Hunger management became a skill. Interestingly, controlled portions were seen as spiritually beneficial. Mild hunger kept the mind sharp and the soul humble. A Templar who felt slightly hungry after a meal was considered properly fed. A Templar who felt satisfied might need reflection. This approach also had practical benefits. Supplies lasted longer. Waste was minimized. No one grew dependent on abundance. The order could sustain itself across long campaigns and harsh environments because no one expected indulgence. In modern terms, this was enforced mindful eating except without mindfulness, joy, or choice. Just discipline, and yet, this system worked. Knights remained fit, mobile, and capable. No sluggishness, no food comas, just steady energy and a constant low-level awareness of restraint. Portion control taught the same lesson as everything else in the Templar's life. You take what you are given, you do not ask for more, and you move forward regardless. Hunger was not a failure, it was a feature. At this point, you might assume that if food was tightly controlled, drink would be even worse. Surprisingly, wine was allowed, just not in the way you're imagining. This was not joyful wine. This was not let's talk about our feelings wine. This was wine treated like a responsible adult treats medicine. Useful, measured, and never trusted completely. Templar Knights were permitted to drink wine because medieval water was often unreliable, occasionally hostile, and sometimes actively trying to kill you. Wine, especially when diluted, was safer. The key word here is diluted. Undiluted wine was considered excessive, risky, and suspiciously close to enjoyment. So, wine was mixed with water, reducing its strength and ensuring that no one accidentally had fun. This created a beverage that tasted like a thoughtful compromise between safety and disappointment. Enough alcohol to keep bacteria away, not enough to loosen tongues or encourage poor decision-making. Drunkenness was strictly forbidden. A drunk Templar was not just embarrassing. He was dangerous. Judgment mattered. Discipline mattered. And nothing undermines discipline faster than someone loudly insisting they could definitely fight 3 men while leaning on a table. Wine was consumed quietly in moderation and usually alongside meals. You did not sip it slowly and reflect on the bouquet. You drank it to stay hydrated and move on with your responsibilities. If you noticed the flavor, that was incidental. There were also rules about who served the wine and how much was poured. No refills without permission. No lingering cups. The cup appeared, did its job, and disappeared again, much like joy in a Templar's life. Interestingly, wine also played a social leveling role. Everyone drank the same thing in the same amount. Rank did not bring better wine. A knight commander did not get a finer vintage than the newest brother. Equality once again was enforced through mild dissatisfaction. In modern terms, wine for a Templar was like coffee at work, allowed, regulated, and intended to keep you functional rather than happy. If you enjoyed it too much, you were probably doing it wrong. So, yes, Templars drank wine, but they did so carefully, quietly, and always with the understanding that too much pleasure was far more dangerous than thirst. Wine was fuel, not escape. One of the most radical ideas in modern dining is choice, menus, options, preferences, allergies, the ability to say, actually, I'm not in the mood for that. None of this existed in a Templar dining hall. Choice was not removed accidentally, it was removed on purpose. A Templar Knight did not have preferences, or rather, he may have had them once long ago before he signed away his personality and received a white cloak in exchange. From that moment on, food was no longer something you selected. It was something you received. There was no asking what was for dinner. There was no hoping for something better tomorrow. There was certainly no saying, I don't really like fish. Disliking food was a private emotion to be processed internally, quietly, and never shared. Expressing preference suggested attachment. Attachment suggested desire. Desire suggested weakness. Weakness, as always, was inconvenient. This absence of choice was intentional training. When you eat what is placed in front of you day after day without comment, you learn a very specific lesson. Your comfort is not the priority, obedience is. And if you can master that lesson at the table, you are far more likely to master it on the battlefield. Meals were identical not just in content, but in experience. Same bowls, same portions, same silence. The lack of variety was not a flaw. It was a feature. Variety encouraged comparison. Comparison encouraged dissatisfaction. Dissatisfaction encouraged thinking. And thinking in excess led to trouble. Even rank did not change this. A senior knight did not receive a different dish. A commander did not get a secret upgrade. Everyone ate the same thing at the same time in the same way. Equality through enforced indifference. In modern terms, the Templar dining system was the opposite of customer service. The order did not care if you enjoyed the meal. The meal was not there for you, you were there for the order. And over time, something interesting happened. Knights stopped expecting food to make them happy. They stopped anticipating meals. Eating became neutral, automatic, unremarkable, which was exactly the point. When food no longer distracts you, when preference no longer matters, when comfort is no longer expected, you become very easy to command. And that more than flavor was always on the menu. In most medieval societies, rank came with perks, better housing, better clothing, better food. If you climbed the social ladder, your plate usually followed. The Knights Templar looked at this idea, considered it carefully, and then removed it entirely. Within the order, rank did not improve your meals. A newly admitted brother, a seasoned knight, and a high-ranking commander all ate essentially the same food in the same portions, prepared the same way. Authority did not earn you extra meat. Leadership did not unlock better bread. Promotion did not come with dessert. This was not an oversight, it was policy. The Templars believed that equality at the table reinforced obedience everywhere else. If leaders ate better, resentment followed. If leaders ate worse, authority weakened. The safest solution was to make everyone equally unimpressed. Shared dissatisfaction was a bonding experience. Even the master of a commandery ate what everyone else ate. Same stew, same bread, same diluted wine. If he wanted luxury, he could have remained a noble. The order made it very clear. You did not rise above your brothers by being fed differently. This also removed a powerful source of ambition. You couldn't climb the ranks for comfort. You couldn't earn better food through obedience. Advancement brought responsibility, not reward, which meant that anyone seeking power for personal gain lost interest very quickly. Meals became one of the few places where rank disappeared entirely. No special seating, no upgraded bowls, no secret kitchen privileges, just long tables, identical portions, and the quiet understanding that no one was special right now. From a practical standpoint, this made logistics easier. Kitchens prepared one meal for everyone. Supplies were distributed evenly. No complicated hierarchies of ingredients, no accounting nightmares. Efficiency and discipline worked hand in hand. In modern terms, this was radical. Imagine a workplace where the CEO eats the same lunch as everyone else every day without complaint. Now, imagine that lunch is lentil stew and hard bread. You begin to understand the commitment involved. The absence of culinary privilege reinforced the order's core message. You are here to serve, not to be served. You lead by example, not by appetite. In the Templar world, authority did not taste better. It tasted exactly the same. By this point, it should be clear that feeding a Templar Knight was never just about nutrition. It was training, constant, quiet, relentless training that began long before the battlefield and continued long after the armor came off. Every meal was designed to condition the mind as much as the body. Eating plain food without complaint trained restraint. Eating the same food every day trained endurance. Eating in silence trained focus. Even mild hunger trained acceptance. The table was simply another drill ground except with fewer swords and more lentils. The Templars understood something modern people often forget. Discipline is easiest to practice in small, boring moments. Anyone can be disciplined during a dramatic charge into battle. That's adrenaline. Real discipline shows up when you are tired, hungry, and staring at another bowl of identical stew. Meals reinforced routine, same time, same place, same rules. The predictability removed decision entirely. You didn't think about food. You didn't anticipate it. You didn't look forward to it. You simply responded to the schedule. This freed the mind for prayer, duty, and not dying violently later. The diet itself supported endurance rather than explosive strength. These were men expected to march long distances, stand guard for hours, and fight while exhausted. Heavy indulgent meals would have slowed them down. Simple food kept energy steady and digestion cooperative. Nothing dramatic, nothing risky. Even the act of stopping when your bowl was empty was training. You learned to recognize limits and accept them without argument. You learned that wanting more did not mean you would receive more. This lesson carried over into every other aspect of Templar life. In modern terms, this was behavioral conditioning disguised as dinner. No motivational speeches required, no shouting, just repetition until obedience became instinct. And over time, it worked. Knights became comfortable with discomfort. They learned to function without pleasure as a reward. Hunger, boredom, and repetition stopped being problems and became background noise. That made them remarkably resilient. When orders came, they obeyed. When conditions were harsh, they endured. When food was scarce, they adapted because they had been practicing all along. Eating for a Templar was not a break from training. It was part of it. At some point, every Templar Knight had to make peace with hunger. Not dramatic, painful starvation, just a quiet, persistent sense that another bowl would have been nice. This was not considered a problem. In fact, it was considered a feature. The Templars believed that mild hunger was good for the soul. A knight who left the table slightly unsatisfied was not underfed. He was properly disciplined. Hunger sharpened awareness, encouraged humility, and prevented the dangerous illusion that life was meant to be comfortable. Comfort once again was suspicious. A full stomach led to drowsiness. Drowsiness led to wandering thoughts. Wandering thoughts led to reflection. reflection in excess led to questions, and questions were rarely helpful to an organization built on obedience and clarity. A slightly hungry knight, on the other hand, stayed alert, focused, and much less interested in philosophical debates. Hunger also reinforced equality. Everyone felt it, no one escaped it. If the entire table stood up from a meal with the same faint dissatisfaction, harmony was preserved. Shared discomfort was a powerful unifying force. It reminded each man that he was part of something larger than his own appetite. There was also a spiritual dimension. Medieval Christianity viewed hunger as a form of discipline and purification. Fasting had long been used to train the will and quiet the body's demands. The Templars didn't fast constantly, but they lived close enough to hunger that fasting never felt shocking. It was familiar, almost comforting in a strange way. From a practical perspective, accepting hunger made logistics easier. Supplies lasted longer, rations stretched further. Campaigns could continue without panic when food ran low. A knight accustomed to abundance breaks quickly when it disappears. A knight accustomed to restraint barely notices the difference. In modern terms, this was deliberate discomfort training, not extreme, not cruel, just consistent enough to reshape expectations. The goal was not to punish the body, but to remove its authority. Over time, hunger lost its power. It stopped demanding attention. It became background noise, like the weight of armor or the sound of marching boots. Something you noticed, acknowledged, and moved past. A Templar did not fear hunger. He did not chase fullness. He accepted the space between, and in that space, the order believed discipline lived. Hunger was not a failure, it was a lesson. By now, it should be clear that food in a Templar's life was doing far more than keeping him alive. It was teaching him something constantly, quietly, relentlessly. Every meal was a lesson, and the curriculum was simple: obedience, restraint, and the understanding that life was not designed around your comfort. The Templars believed that the body was not an enemy, but it was definitely not in charge. Food was one of the easiest ways to remind it of that fact. Plain meals taught humility, repetition taught patience, controlled portions taught self-command, and the absence of indulgence taught something even more important. You could survive without getting what you wanted. This wasn't accidental. The order understood human psychology better than it let on. If you train a man to obey rules when he is tired and hungry, he will obey them when he is rested and afraid. If you teach him to accept disappointment at the table, he will accept hardship on the march. Even flavor played a role. Food that was too enjoyable invited lingering. Lingering invited attachment. Attachment invited longing for comfort beyond the table. So meals were kept deliberately neutral. Not bad enough to cause rebellion, not good enough to cause desire. A perfect balance of fine and that will do. Meals also reinforced identity. You were not an individual expressing taste. You were a brother participating in a shared rule. Eating the same food at the same time in the same way dissolved individuality and replaced it with belonging. The message was clear: you are part of something larger, and that something eats lentils. There was also a moral warning built into every bite. Excess was dangerous. Desire was distracting. Pleasure was not evil, but it was unnecessary. The Templars were not trying to punish the body. They were trying to prevent it from negotiating. In modern terms, this was behavioral conditioning disguised as nutrition. No speeches required, no dramatic rituals, just daily repetition until the lesson sank in. Food taught the knight to accept limits, to resist impulse, to value purpose over pleasure. And when you live that lesson every day, it stops feeling restrictive. It starts feeling normal. That was the real achievement of the Templar diet. Not strength, not endurance, but the quiet reshaping of expectation. By the time a knight rose from the table, he had not just eaten. He had been reminded once again of who he was meant to be. In the end, feeding a Templar Knight was never about food. Food was just the delivery system. The real purpose was to sustain a life built on obedience, endurance, and the quiet acceptance that comfort was not part of the contract. Every meal reinforced the same message: you are not here for yourself. The bread that resisted chewing, the soup that tasted exactly like yesterday's soup, the fish that appeared more often than anyone wanted, the portions that ended just before satisfaction, all of it worked together to create a knight who expected little and endured much. The Templars did not try to make men strong by feeding them richly. They made them strong by teaching them to function without luxury. A knight who could fight, pray, march, and think clearly on plain food was a knight who would not fall apart when conditions worsened, and conditions always worsened. This diet shaped bodies? Yes, lean, durable, capable of long effort. But more importantly, it shaped expectations. A Templar did not wake up hoping for a good meal. He woke up expecting duty. Food simply supported that expectation, like armor supports the body, heavy, restrictive, and necessary. And this system worked. For generations, the order maintained discipline across vast distances, hostile environments, and constant pressure. They marched, guarded, and fought without needing incentives beyond purpose and structure. Their meals were not rewards, they were routines. In modern terms, feeding a Templar Knight was closer to maintaining a machine than hosting a human being. You gave it what it needed. No more, no less. If the machine complained, that was a flaw to be corrected, not a request to be honored. There is something unsettling about that and something impressive. Because in a world obsessed with comfort, the Templars built an identity around restraint. They proved that you could remove pleasure from daily life and still function at a high level. Not happily, not comfortably, but effectively. So, when you imagine a Templar at the table, do not picture feasting. Picture quiet chewing, steady posture, eyes lowered, no anticipation of dessert, just fuel, just obedience, just another day prepared for whatever came next. And for a Templar Knight, that was always enough. Empress Feng did not enter history through triumph or conquest. She entered it through loss. Born into the powerful Feng clan during the 5th century, her early life unfolded amid the brutal realities of northern Wei court politics, where power shifted suddenly and mercy was rare. When her family fell victim to political purges, their status collapsed almost overnight. Adult men were executed or exiled. Women and children were absorbed into the palace system, stripped of their former identities. Feng was still young when she was taken into the imperial household, not as royalty, but as a consort in training, a life defined by silence, obedience, and constant surveillance. The northern Wei court was not a place of comfort. It was a machine built on ritual, suspicion, and hierarchy. Every gesture carried meaning. Every word could be repeated. For a young woman without family protection, survival depended on restraint and observation. Feng learned quickly. She listened more than she spoke. She watched how officials competed for influence, how imperial relatives rose and fell, and how emperors were often controlled by those who appeared weakest. In this environment, patience was not a virtue, it was a weapon. Her fate changed when she was chosen as consort to Emperor Wenchang. The match was political, not romantic, but it placed Feng closer to the center of power than most women ever reached. When the emperor died prematurely, leaving behind a child heir, the empire entered a dangerous phase. Child emperors meant regents, regents meant struggle, and struggle often ended in blood. Against expectation, Feng emerged not as a casualty, but as the solution. Elevated to Empress Dia, she became regent for the young emperor. This transition was extraordinary. A woman whose family had once been destroyed by court politics now stood at the head of the same system that had consumed them. But she did not rule impulsively. She ruled carefully, understanding that authority in northern Wei China depended not on declarations, but on stability. From the beginning, Feng framed her power as necessity, not ambition. She presented herself as a guardian of the dynasty, not its master. This distinction mattered. By emphasizing continuity and order, she neutralized opposition before it could form. What began as a regency born of crisis would become one of the most consequential periods in Northern Wei history. And it all started with a girl who learned very early that survival was the first step toward rule. Empress Feng understood something that many rulers never grasped. Power was not held by issuing commands, but by mastering systems. As regent, she did not immediately attempt sweeping reforms or dramatic displays of authority. That would have been dangerous. The Northern Wei court was dominated by entrenched aristocratic clans, military elites, and senior officials who viewed a female regent as temporary at best, illegitimate at worst. Fun's first task was not to rule, it was to endure. She began by studying the machinery of governance, court rituals, legal procedures, land administration, military appointments. None of these were abstract concepts, they were levers. Fun attended meetings quietly, allowing ministers to speak freely, often at length. This silence was strategic. Officials revealed their ambitions, rivalries, and weaknesses without realizing they were being observed. Over time, she learned who valued stability, who thrived on chaos, and who could be trusted only when watched closely. Rather than purge the court, Fun preserved it. She retained experienced officials, even those who doubted her authority, because continuity mattered more than loyalty in the early years. Abrupt changes would have signaled insecurity. Stability, on the other hand, projected confidence. Slowly, the court adjusted. Ministers stopped waiting for a male regent to appear. They brought their concerns directly to her. Fun also understood the importance of legitimacy. As a non-Waber woman ruling a Shanbei dynasty, she occupied an unusual position. Instead of resisting this, she reframed it. She emphasized Confucian ideals of moral governance while respecting step traditions valued by the ruling elite. This dual approach allowed her to speak to both sides of the empire without alienating either. It was not compromise, it was synthesis. Behind the scenes, Fun reorganized palace authority. Eunuchs often used as power brokers were placed under stricter supervision. Imperial relatives were kept close, but politically limited. The regent reduced opportunities for factional alliances by dispersing influence across multiple offices. No single group was allowed to dominate. Balance became policy. Perhaps most importantly, Fun avoided the appearance of permanence. She consistently referred to her role as temporary guardianship, ruling only until the emperor came of age. This reassured officials while giving her room to act. In practice, she was already shaping the future of the dynasty. But she did so quietly, patiently, building control, not through fear, but through structure. By the end of this phase, Fun was no longer merely surviving the court. She was directing it, and the empire for the first time in years was steady. Empress Feng did not see government as something that existed only in palaces and memorials. To her, rule began in the countryside. Northern Wei China in the 5th century was scarred by decades of warfare, forced migrations, and uneven land control. Powerful clans accumulated estates while small farmers disappeared into debt, flight, or servitude. An empire could not survive this imbalance for long. Feng understood that if the state did not reclaim its relationship with the land, it would lose its people. One of her most consequential moves was to strengthen and expand systems of land regulation. Rather than allowing aristocrats to absorb farmland unchecked, the court reasserted control over land distribution and taxation. Peasant households were registered more carefully, ensuring that taxes were assessed more evenly and that labor obligations were not arbitrarily increased by local elites. This was not benevolence alone, it was strategy. A stable tax base meant predictable revenue, and predictable revenue meant fewer military revolts. Fun also worked to reduce the abuse of corv labor. Farmers were the backbone of the dynasty's economy, but they had long been treated as expendable. Under her direction, limits were placed on forced labor demands, especially during planting and harvest seasons. These adjustments may seem minor, but they had profound effects. Villages that could feed themselves were less likely to rebel or flee. The empire grew quieter, not because of fear, but because daily life became more survivable. At the same time, Feng's strength and central oversight. Provincial governors were monitored more closely, their appointments rotated to prevent the formation of local power bases. Reports were standardized, making it harder to hide corruption behind vague language. Officials who exploited peasants to openly were removed, not with spectacle, but with efficiency. The message was clear: authority flowed downward from the court, not upward from private estates. These reforms also served a cultural purpose by emphasizing orderly administration and moral governance. Feng aligned the dynasty more closely with Chinese bureaucratic ideals. This helped integrate the Northern Wei state into broader traditions of imperial rule, reducing the perception that it was merely a conqueror regime imposed from outside. By reinforcing the link between land, people, and state, Feng transformed governance into something durable. Her power no longer rested solely on her position as regent. It rested on systems that functioned even in her absence. And that more than any decree marked the beginning of lasting imperial reform. Empress Feng understood that belief could stabilize an empire as effectively as laws. In a realm fractured by ethnic divisions, recent conquest, and lingering distrust between ruling elites and the population, ideology mattered. Feng did not treat religion as a personal refuge or court ornament. She treated it as state infrastructure. Buddhism, already spreading across northern China, offered a moral language that transcended clan and origin. Feng recognized its political potential immediately. Under her regency, Buddhism received unprecedented imperial support. Monasteries were expanded, monks were protected, and religious institutions were formally integrated into the state. This was not blind patronage. Feng imposed regulations on monastic land holdings and ensured that temples operated within defined limits. The goal was balance. Buddhism was to guide morals and unify communities, not become an untouchable power unto itself. Buddhist ideals of compassion, restraint, and moral authority aligned well with Feng's broader vision of governance. She promoted the image of the ruler as a caretaker rather than a conqueror. This messaging was especially effective in regions recently absorbed into northern Wei control, where resentment toward military rule still lingered. Temples became centers of education, charity, and social order. They fed the poor during shortages, mediated disputes, and reinforced loyalty to the state without the need for soldiers. At court, Feng used Buddhism to legitimize her authority as a woman. Rather than challenge patriarchal norms directly, she sidestepped them. Buddhist teachings offered precedents for female virtue, spiritual authority, and moral guardianship. By associating her regency with religious merit and ethical duty, Feng reframed her power as righteous stewardship. Critics found it harder to accuse her of ambition when she presented herself as acting in accordance with cosmic order. This religious policy also helped soften ethnic divisions within the empire. The Northern Wei ruling class originated from steppe traditions. While much of the population followed Chinese customs, Buddhism, not native to either group, provided common ground. It allowed Feng to unify diverse subjects under a shared spiritual framework without forcing cultural assimilation too abruptly. By the time her policies were fully implemented, Buddhism was no longer simply a faith within Northern Wei. It was a pillar of the state, and through it, Feng reinforced unity, legitimacy, and moral authority, without ever needing to raise her voice or her sword. Empress Feng knew that internal collapse, not foreign invasion, posed the greatest threat to the dynasty. The Northern Wei court was crowded with powerful clans, ambitious generals, and imperial relatives who believed proximity to the throne entitled them to influence. Past regents had tried to dominate this environment through intimidation and purges, often triggering the very rebellions they sought to prevent. Feng chose a different path. She focused on control through structure rather than fear. One of her first priorities was reducing the political power of imperial relatives. Historically, regencies in China collapsed when uncles, cousins, or in-laws claimed authority in the name of blood ties. Feng limited this risk by keeping relatives close to the court, but far from real command. They were granted titles, stipends, and ceremonial roles, symbols without substance. This approach neutralized resentment while preventing the formation of rival centers of power. At the same time, Fun refined the bureaucratic hierarchy. Offices were clarified, responsibilities narrowly defined, and chains of command reinforced. Overlapping authority, a frequent source of factional conflict, was deliberately reduced. Officials were encouraged to specialize rather than compete across domains. This made administration more efficient and crucially made conspiracies harder to organize. When everyone knew their role, deviations stood out. Fun also transformed how decisions were made. Rather than relying on informal influence, she insisted on written memorials, documented procedures, and recorded outcomes. This created institutional memory and reduced the ability of individuals to manipulate policy through personal access. Ministers who once relied on charisma or intimidation found themselves constrained by paperwork and precedent. Power shifted from personalities to process. Crucially, Fun avoided public humiliation of officials. Even when removing corrupt or disloyal figures, she acted with restraint. Dismissals were framed as administrative corrections, not moral crusades. This preserved dignity and discouraged desperate retaliation. The court remained tense, but it functioned. Through these methods, Fun accomplished something rare. She created a court that feared disorder more than authority. Stability became a shared interest. By the middle of her regency, opposition no longer organized around overthrowing her. Instead, it adapted to the system she had built. The court still whispered, it always would. But whispers are far less dangerous than swords. Empress Fun understood that regency was by definition temporary. But she also knew that releasing power too abruptly could undo everything she had built. Her challenge was delicate. Prepare the young emperor to rule while ensuring that the transition would not revive factional chaos. Education therefore became a political act. From early childhood, the emperor's upbringing was carefully structured. Tutors were selected not only for learning, but for temperament. Fun avoided scholars known for rigid ideology or personal ambition. She favored instructors who emphasized discipline, moral responsibility, and administrative competence. The goal was not brilliance, but steadiness. An emperor did not need to be exceptional. He needed to be predictable. Fun also controlled access. Courtiers who sought to influence the emperor were filtered through layers of supervision. Childhood friendships were monitored. Gifts were regulated. Even casual conversations were noted. This was not paranoia. It was prevention. Fong had seen how easily young rulers became instruments of stronger personalities. She would not allow her work to be undone by flattery whispered into a child's ear. At the same time, she avoided isolating the emperor completely. He was gradually introduced to court rituals, audiences, and administrative procedures. Fun often observed silently as he presided over minor matters, intervening only when necessary. These moments were instructional. Mistakes were corrected privately, preserving imperial dignity. Successes were attributed to the emperor himself. Public perception mattered. The court needed to see a ruler forming, not a puppet performing. As the emperor matured, Fun slowly reduced her visible presence. Edicts increasingly bore his authority. Audiences were framed as his decisions, even when guided behind the scenes. This gradual shift allowed officials to adjust without panic. There was no single moment of transfer, no vacuum to exploit. Power flowed rather than dropped. Yet Fun never relinquished oversight prematurely. Final authority remained hers until she was confident that institutions, not personalities, would carry the state forward. By the time she stepped back, the court no longer revolved around her presence. It revolved around procedures she had embedded into daily governance. In shaping the emperor, Fun ensured continuity. She did not seek legacy through monuments or proclamations. Her legacy was subtler. It lived in habits, expectations, and restraint. When she finally loosened her grip, the empire did not shake, it held. Empress Fun ruled during a period when the Northern Wei dynasty stood at a crossroads. The empire was expanding, but expansion brought strain. Newly incorporated regions differed in language, customs, and loyalty. Military governors governed far from the capital. Old aristocracies remembered former independence. The danger was not immediate collapse, but slow fragmentation. Fun's task was to bind these pieces together without forcing unity faster than it could endure. Her approach relied on administrative integration rather than cultural erasure. Local elites were not removed wholesale. Instead, they were absorbed. Promising regional figures were offered court positions, marriages, or educational opportunities in the capital. This brought talent inward while weakening the appeal of regional separatism. Loyalty was rewarded with inclusion, not fear. Over time, ambition redirected itself toward the center. Fun also strengthened communication between provinces and court. Regular reporting schedules were enforced. Messengers and inspection officials traveled more frequently, reducing the autonomy that distance once provided. Governors understood that neglect or abuse would not go unnoticed, even hundreds of miles away. This did not eliminate corruption, but it narrowed the space in which it could thrive. Military authority was treated with similar care. Feng respected the army's importance, but she avoided allowing generals to become political actors. Commands were rotated. Honors were distributed broadly rather than concentrated. Victories were celebrated as imperial achievements, not personal triumphs. By keeping military prestige tied to the dynasty rather than individuals, she prevented the emergence of warlords. At the ideological level, Fun emphasized order and continuity. Laws were standardized across regions where possible, reducing confusion and resentment. Ritual practices were adjusted gradually, allowing local customs to coexist under imperial frameworks. The message was consistent. The empire did not demand sameness, only loyalty and stability. What made these efforts effective was restraint. Fun did not attempt to solve every problem immediately. She prioritized cohesion over perfection. Regions were allowed to adapt at different speeds as long as the direction remained clear. The state became less brittle, more flexible. By maintaining unity through administration, communication, and inclusion, Fun ensured that the Northern Wei Empire did not tear itself apart under the weight of its own growth. It remained whole, not because it was forced to be, but because it worked. Empress Fun paid a price for the stability she created. Long regencies rarely end without resentment, and Fun's was no exception. By the later years of her rule, the empire was orderly, revenues were reliable, and rebellion was rare. But beneath the surface, tension accumulated. Officials who had grown up entirely under her authority began to chafe against it. Younger courtiers, ambitious and impatient, viewed her continued influence as an obstacle rather than a safeguard. Fun was not unaware of this shift. She had always understood that power, when held too visibly for too long, invites resistance regardless of results. Her response was not repression. Instead, she narrowed her involvement. Matters she once handled personally were delegated. Court audiences became shorter. Decisions increasingly followed established procedure rather than personal instruction. This withdrawal was calculated, but it was also risky. To sudden a retreat could expose weaknesses she had spent decades concealing. There were also personal costs. Fun had no traditional family life. Her position required emotional distance, constant vigilance, and a public image of composure that left little room for private grief or attachment. The court respected her, but few loved her. That isolation was the price of being indispensable. In stabilizing the empire, she had made herself singular, and singular figures are always alone. Criticism, once muted, became more open. Some accused her of ruling too long. Others whispered that the dynasty had become dependent on her judgment. Fun did not respond publicly. She had learned early that answering every accusation only amplified it. Silence once again became her shield. Yet she did not cling to authority blindly. Fun prepared for the end of her regency as carefully as she had prepared for its beginning. She ensured that succession protocols were clear, that officials understood their roles, and that no single faction stood ready to seize control. Her final years were devoted less to innovation than to preservation. When Feng's direct influence finally faded, the empire did not celebrate, nor did it collapse. The quiet outcome was her final success. The cost of her authority had been personal, prolonged, and heavy. But it had spared the dynasty a far greater price. Empress Feng did not leave behind a dramatic final act. There was no coup, no violent reckoning, no sudden unraveling of power. Instead, her departure from the center of authority was almost anticlimactic, and that was precisely the point. Empires usually reveal the quality of their rulers, not during moments of strength, but at the moment they step away. In this test, Feng succeeded. By the time her influence fully receded, the Northern Wei state no longer depended on her presence to function. Officials knew their responsibilities. Provincial governors understood the limits of their authority. The emperor ruled within a framework shaped by discipline rather than impulse. Laws were enforced through procedure, not favoritism. The court no longer waited for a single voice to decide its direction. It moved according to patterns Feng had spent decades embedding. Her greatest achievement was not any single reform, but coherence. She transformed a conquest dynasty into a working imperial system capable of governing a diverse population. Agriculture was protected, revenue stabilized, religion integrated, and administration standardized. None of these changes were revolutionary on their own. Together, they created endurance. Feng's promotion of Buddhism left a visible cultural imprint that extended far beyond her lifetime. Temples, art, and religious scholarship flourished under the condition she created, shaping northern China's spiritual landscape for generations. Equally important, her synthesis of steppe leadership traditions with Chinese bureaucratic governance helped redefine what the Northern Wei dynasty was and what it could become. History did not always treat her generously. Later chroniclers writing in male-dominated traditions often minimized her role or framed her authority as anomalous. Yet the stability of the mid and Northern Wei period speaks for itself. Empires do not remain intact through coincidence, they endure through careful design. Feng ruled without a crown in her own name, without founding a new dynasty, and without rewriting history to glorify herself. Her power was exercised in restraint, not spectacle. When she stepped aside, the state remained calm. That calm was her monument. In a world where rulers are often remembered for conquest or collapse, Empress Feng stands apart. She ruled so that she would not need to be remembered to be successful. The empire she shaped carried on, not because of who she was, but because of what she built. Crowns were never created for beauty alone. In the ancient world, they existed to solve a political problem that every early society faced: how to make authority instantly recognizable. Power needed to be visible, unquestioned, and unmistakable, especially in cultures where most people would never read laws or hear formal proclamations. A crown answered that need in a single glance. Before crowns, leadership relied heavily on personal reputation, physical presence, or ritual performance. But as societies grew larger and more complex, this was no longer enough. Rulers had to project legitimacy beyond their immediate circle. They needed a symbol that could speak for them when they were silent, distant, or unseen. The crown became that symbol. It announced hierarchy before words were spoken and reminded observers that power was not evenly distributed. What made crowns effective was their separation from ordinary human appearance. They sat above the head, the highest point of the body, visually lifting the ruler closer to the heavens. This was not accidental. In many ancient belief systems, the head was associated with the soul, reason, or divine connection. Placing an object that transformed the ruler into something more than human, part political figure, part sacred vessel, crowns also turned abstract ideas into physical objects. Concepts like divine favor, ancestral right, cosmic balance, or imperial unity are invisible on their own. A crown made them visible. Gold suggested permanence. Dims implied celestial power. Height conveyed dominance. Even simplicity could signal restraint and moral authority. Every design choice communicated something about why a ruler deserved obedience. Importantly, crowns were not interchangeable ornaments. They were tightly controlled symbols, often restricted by law or custom. To wear a crown without authorization was not fashion, it was rebellion. This exclusivity reinforced their power. When only one person in a society could wear a specific crown, that object became synonymous with rule itself. Crowns also worked psychologically. They trained subjects to associate authority with appearance. Over time, people learned to obey the symbol as much as the person wearing it. This made rule more stable. Even a weak or distant ruler could command respect as long as the crown remained intact and visible. In this way, crowns were tools, not tools of vanity, but tools of governance. They condensed power, belief, and hierarchy into a single object, one that could be seen, remembered, and feared. Long before written constitutions or standing armies, the crown made rule possible by making power visible. In ancient Egypt, a crown was never just a marker of rank. It was a statement about how the universe itself was ordered. Egyptian kingship rested on the idea that the ruler did not merely govern people, but marked the fragile balance between chaos and order. The crown was the most visible proof that this balance was being upheld. The most powerful of these symbols was the double crown formed by the union of two older crowns. The white crown of Upper Egypt and the red crown of Lower Egypt, when fused together, they created a single headdress that proclaimed unity. To wear it was to declare mastery over the entire land from the southern Nile to the Mediterranean delta. Political geography became wearable theology. This mattered because ancient Egypt was not naturally unified. The Nile Valley encouraged regional identities and fragmentation was a constant threat. The double crown turned unity into a sacred condition rather than a temporary political arrangement. As long as the king wore it, Egypt was whole, not because borders were defended, but because the cosmos demanded it. The crown also reinforced the pharaoh's semi-dean status. Egyptian rulers were not gods in the abstract. They were living conduits between the human and divine worlds. The crown visually elevated the pharaoh, linking his body to the gods above and the land below. This was why crowns appeared constantly in temple reliefs and statuary. The ruler was rarely shown bareheaded. To depict a pharaoh without a crown was to depict him incomplete. Different crowns were used in different ritual contexts. Some emphasized fertility and rebirth. Others highlighted military authority or judgment. Switching crowns was not costume change, it was role change. The king adapted his symbolic identity depending on what aspect of cosmic order he was enacting. The coronation, therefore, was not a single moment, but a sequence of transformations, each marked by a crown. What made Egyptian crowns especially powerful was continuity. Their forms remained recognizable for millennia. Dynasties rose and fell, but the visual language of kingship endured. This stability reinforced the idea that Egypt itself was eternal, even when individual rulers were not. In Egypt, the crown did not say, "I rule," it said, "The world is still in balance," and as long as that crown remained on the pharaoh's head, chaos, at least symbolically, was held at bay. In the Persian world, crowns carried a different message than in Egypt. Where Egyptian crowns emphasized cosmic balance, Persian royal headgear emphasized scale. The kings of the Achaemenid Empire did not present themselves as guardians of a single sacred land, but as rulers of many peoples, languages, and traditions at once. Their crowns were designed to express universal authority rather than local divinity. Persian kings did not favor tall, exaggerated crowns. Instead, they wore structured headgear often described as tiaras or diadems, soft caps or circlets, sometimes tied with ribbons, sometimes reinforced with gold. This restraint was deliberate. Persian kingship was built on the idea that the ruler stood above nations, not gods above humans. The king ruled by divine favor, but he was not divine himself. This distinction mattered politically. The Achaemenid Empire governed an enormous and diverse population stretching from Anatolia to Central Asia. Imposing a single religious identity would have been disastrous. Instead, Persian crowns symbolized legitimized supremacy. The right to rule granted by the supreme god Ahura Mazda, but exercised through law tolerance and administration. Royal reliefs from Pepololis consistently show the king wearing the same controlled headgear, while delegations from subject peoples approach him in their own distinct dress. The message is subtle but powerful. Diversity exists, but hierarchy is fixed. The crown marks the only figure who stands above all others, not by erasing difference, but by containing it. The Persian crown also worked in motion. During ceremonies, audiences, and military inspections, the king's headgear identified him instantly, even without elaborate regalia. This was important in an empire where the ruler traveled constantly. Authority needed to be portable. The crown became a mobile throne, recognizable in every province. Color and material reinforced ideology. Rich, but not excessive decoration suggested wealth without indulgence. Symmetry suggested order. The lack of towering height avoided association with tyranny. Persian kings wanted obedience, not or-driven terror. Their crown communicated command through composure. Perhaps most importantly, the Persian crown was inseparable from the concept of kingship itself. To rebel against the king was not merely to oppose a person. It was to reject the rightful order of the empire. Claimants who failed to secure royal insignia were treated as impostors regardless of bloodline. In Persia, the crown did not claim holiness. It claimed legitimacy over the known world. It said quietly, but firmly, that rule was not confined to one land, but extended, wherever the king's authority could reach and be recognized. In the Greek world, crowns carried an unusual contradiction. Power was real, but its symbols were deliberately restrained. Unlike Egypt or Persia, most Greek societies were deeply suspicious of monarchy. Authority was expected to be temporary, accountable, and earned rather than inherited. As a result, Greek crowns rarely symbolized permanent rule. Instead, they symbolized momentary excellence. Greek crowns were often wreaths made of olive, laurel, oak, or ivy. These materials were organic, fragile, and perishable by design. A wreath could wither, break, or be discarded. That impermanence was the point. In Greek thought, no human was meant to hold power forever. Even the greatest achievements were temporary flashes of glory. This symbolism was especially visible in athletic and religious contexts. Victors in games were crowned not with gold but with leaves. The crown honored achievement, not authority. It elevated the individual for a moment, then returned them to equality. In this sense, the Greek crown celebrated merit without threatening the social order. When kings did exist in the Greek world, particularly in earlier periods or on the fringes of Greek culture, their crowns remained understated. Even powerful rulers avoided excessive regalia. To appear too elevated was to invite accusations of tyranny. Greek political culture associated towering crowns and rigid headgear with Eastern despotism. A ruler who looked too divine was a ruler who had gone too far. Greek gods, interestingly, were crowned more lavishly than Greek rulers. Divine figures wore radiating crowns, wreaths, or elaborate headpieces that clearly separated them from humans. This reinforced a crucial boundary. Gods could be eternal and absolute. Humans could not. A mortal who dressed like a god was violating the natural order. This separation shaped Greek political ideology. Authority was expected to be visible but limited. Symbols had to reinforce restraint rather than dominance. Even later, Hellenistic rulers who adopted more elaborate crowns after the conquests of Alexander the Great struggled with this tension. Their diadems borrowed from Persian models, but Greek audiences never fully accepted them as natural. In Greece, the absence of a permanent crown was itself a statement. It said that power belonged to the community, not the individual. Leadership was a role, not an identity. The crown, when it appeared at all, was light enough to remove. This resistance to crown permanence would echo far beyond Greece. It planted an idea that authority could exist without divine costume, an idea that would later challenge empires built on gold, height, and spectacle. In ancient Rome, a crown was dangerous, not because it lacked power, but because it symbolized the wrong kind of power. Roman political culture was built on a deep hostility toward kingship. The memory of expelled monarchs lingered for centuries, shaping a system where authority had to be justified as service to the state, not personal domination. As a result, wearing a crown in Rome was not a declaration of legitimacy. It was an accusation. Early Roman leaders avoided crowns entirely. Even victorious generals celebrated in triumphs did not wear royal headgear. Instead, they were granted temporary honors, wreaths, laurel crowns, or civic crowns awarded for specific acts like saving Roman citizens. These were rewards, not claims. They elevated achievement without implying permanent authority. This distinction mattered intensely. In Rome, power was supposed to be collective, institutional, and reversible. Magistrates held office for fixed terms. Even dictators, in theory, relinquished control once emergencies passed. A crown suggested something else entirely: permanence, personal sovereignty, and rule above the law. That was unacceptable. The tension reached its peak during the late Republic. As individuals accumulated unprecedented power, the symbolism of crowns became explosive. When Julius Caesar was offered a diadem, the crowd reacted with shock. His refusal was staged, but the message was clear. Accepting a crown would have confirmed fears that Rome was sliding back into monarchy. Caesar's assassination soon followed, not because he wore a crown, but because many believed he intended to. After the Republic collapsed, Roman emperors faced a symbolic dilemma. They ruled as monarchs in practice, but could not appear as kings. Early emperors avoided crowns and preferred modest headbands or wreaths. Authority was expressed through titles, military command, and ritual, not through a single dominating object. Only later, under stronger imperial control, did crowns slowly return to Roman imagery. Even then, they were carefully framed. Crowns symbolized victory, divine favor, or cosmic order, but never overt kingship. The emperor was presented as first among citizens, even when that was no longer true. Rome's uneasy relationship with crowns reveals something essential. Symbols do not just reflect power, they test it. In Rome, a crown did not make a ruler stronger, it made him vulnerable. And for centuries, that fear shaped how authority dressed itself carefully, cautiously, and always aware that one wrong symbol could end an empire. In early imperial China, crowns were never meant to dazzle, they were meant to instruct. Unlike the gold-heavy regalia of other civilizations, Chinese imperial headgear emphasized restraint, balance, and moral responsibility. Authority was not proven by excess, but by self-control. A ruler's crown was a visual reminder that power existed to serve order, not ego. The most iconic form of Chinese imperial headwear was the miangguan, a ceremonial crown featuring hanging beads that partially obscured the emperor's face. This design was deliberate and deeply symbolic. The strands in front reminded the ruler to avoid improper sights. Those at the back warned against careless speech. The crown physically limited the emperor's senses, reinforcing the idea that a true ruler governed through discipline rather than impulse. This symbolism reflected a broader political philosophy. In Chinese thought, legitimacy did not come from conquest alone, it came from moral alignment with heaven. The ruler was expected to act as a mediator between cosmic order and human society. If he ruled justly, heaven supported him. If he ruled poorly, heaven withdrew its mandate. The crown, therefore, was not proof of eternal right. It was conditional. Materials reinforced this message. Chinese crowns were often simple in form, emphasizing symmetry and proportion rather than height or spectacle. Even when made with precious materials, they avoided flamboyance. Excessive display was associated with moral decay. A ruler who dressed too extravagantly was signaling imbalance, and imbalance invited disaster, crowns were also closely regulated. Specific styles were permitted only in certain rituals, seasons, or ceremonies. Wearing the wrong crown at the wrong time was a serious breach of protocol. This reinforced hierarchy and reminded everyone, including the emperor, that authority operated within rules. The crown did not free the ruler from restraint, it bound him to it. Importantly, Chinese crowns emphasized continuity over individuality. They changed little from one reign to the next. The ruler was less important than the role he inhabited. This discouraged personal cults of personality and reinforced the idea that the state outlived any one emperor. In this system, the crown did not proclaim dominance, it demanded responsibility. It said that rule was not a privilege to enjoy, but a burden to carry correctly. And when that burden was mishandled, the crown itself lost meaning, becoming a hollow symbol of authority heaven no longer recognized. In ancient China, the crown did not elevate the ruler above morality, it placed him beneath it. In the societies of early medieval Northern Europe, especially during the Scandinavia-centered Viking Age, crowns played a far quieter role than in great empires. There were no towering diadems or gem-encrusted symbols of divine kingship. Power in the north was negotiated, personal, and constantly tested. As a result, crowns existed less as instruments of domination and more as signs of recognition. Viking rulers did not rule by sacred mandate alone. They ruled because others accepted their leadership. Kings were war leaders, lawakers, and gift-givers. Their authority depended on reputation, success, and generosity. A ruler who failed to provide victory or wealth quickly lost followers. In such a system, an elaborate crown would have meant little without loyalty to support it. When crowns or circlets did appear, they were modest, thin bands of metal, often silver or bronze, worn during assemblies, rituals, or diplomacy. These were not objects meant to awe, they marked status within a social contract. The crown acknowledged that a man had been chosen, not that he was untouchable. It could just as easily be removed as granted. This symbolism aligned with Northern ideas of leadership. Kings were first among equals, not divine intermediaries. Even legendary rulers were expected to listen at assemblies and defend their decisions. The crown, therefore, did not elevate the wearer above law. It confirmed his responsibility to uphold it. Mythology reinforced this restraint. Northern gods wore helmets or circlets in battle, but even they were bound by fate. No crown granted immunity from destiny. This worldview discouraged absolute authority. Power was temporary, contingent, and earned repeatedly through action. As Christianity spread northward, crowns slowly changed meaning. Christian kings adopted more formal regalia influenced by Roman and continental models. Crowns became symbols of divine approval rather than communal consent, yet even then older traditions lingered. Northern kings were crowned, but they were also expected to prove themselves continually through rule and war. The contrast is revealing. In the north, the crown followed power rather than creating it. It acknowledged leadership that already existed instead of inventing it. This made crowns less central, but also more honest. They reflected reality rather than imposing ideology. In these societies, a crown did not command obedience by itself. It confirmed that obedience had already been given and could be withdrawn if the ruler failed to deserve it. Not all ancient crowns were forged from gold or shaped from metal. In many civilizations, the most powerful crowns were symbolic constructions made of feathers, light, or ritual authority rather than permanent materials. These crowns mattered not because they endured physically, but because they connected rulers to forces believed to transcend the human world. In ancient Mesoamerica, crowns often took the form of elaborate feathered headdresses. Feathers from rare birds were valued more highly than precious metals because they symbolized the sky, the sun, and divine breath. To wear such a crown was to embody cosmic energy. The ruler was not merely appointed by gods. He visually merged with them. These headdresses were fragile and temporary, reinforcing the idea that power itself was fleeting and had to be constantly renewed through ritual and sacrifice. In South Asia, crowns carried yet another layer of meaning. Kingship was linked to dharma, the moral law governing the universe. Crowns symbolized the ruler's duty to uphold this order rather than dominate subjects. Some rulers were depicted with radiant halos or stylized crowns of light, suggesting spiritual illumination rather than material authority. Here the crown was less an object and more a visible sign of inner alignment with cosmic truth. These traditions shared a common assumption: authority was conditional. A ruler who lost divine favor or moral balance did not merely lose political support. He lost legitimacy at a cosmic level. The crown, whether feathered or symbolic, could not protect him. In fact, it often amplified his failure, making the fall more dramatic and more public. Ritual renewal was essential. Crowns were donned during ceremonies, removed afterward, and sometimes destroyed intentionally. This prevented rulers from confusing temporary authority with permanent right. Power was something bestowed, not owned. Each coronation reaffirmed a relationship between ruler, people, and the unseen world. These non-metal crowns challenge modern assumptions about power. They remind us that authority does not require permanence to be effective. In some societies, durability was a weakness. A crown that could not decay risked suggesting power that could not be questioned. By stepping away from metal and stone, these cultures emphasized an uncomfortable truth. Rule is fragile. It exists only as long as belief sustains it. Their crowns were lighter, more temporary, but often more honest. They did not claim eternity, they demanded renewal. Across ancient civilizations, crowns looked radically different, but they performed the same essential task. They translated invisible ideas into visible form. Whether made of gold, leaves, feathers, or light, a crown answered a single question every society had to confront. Why should this person rule? The answer varied, but the logic was consistent. In Egypt, the crown said the universe was in balance. In Persia, it declared authority over diversity. In Greece, its absence warned against permanence. In Rome, it threatened death. In China, it restrained the ruler with morality. In the North, it confirmed recognition rather than command. Elsewhere, crowns dissolved into ritual and renewal, reminding everyone that power could fade as easily as it appeared. What unites these traditions is that crowns were never neutral. They were arguments. Every crown made a claim about the nature of authority itself. Was power divine or conditional, eternal or temporary, personal or institutional? The shape, material, and rules surrounding a crown encoded political ideology more clearly than any written law most people would ever read. Crowns also reveal a deeper truth about early states. Power was fragile. Rulers could command armies, but belief was harder to control. A crown helped stabilize belief by giving it form. People obeyed not only the individual but the symbol. Over time, obedience transferred from the person to the office, from the ruler to the role. That shift made empires possible. Yet, crowns also carried risk. When symbols outgrew reality, they became liabilities. A crown worn without legitimacy invited rebellion. A crown worn to boldly exposed fear beneath authority. History is full of rulers who learned too late that symbols demand consistency. Once belief cracks, the crown becomes decoration, and decoration cannot rule. Perhaps the most important lesson is this: crowns did not create power, they condensed it. They worked only when supported by institutions, belief systems, and social consent. Where those collapsed, crowns fell with them, sometimes literally. In the end, ancient crowns were mirrors. They reflected what societies believed about hierarchy, justice, and the limits of human authority. Strip away the golden feathers, and what remains is a shared human problem. How to justify obedience without relying on force alone. Crowns were one solution. Not perfect, not universal, but powerful enough to shape civilizations and fragile enough to remind us that rule, like belief, must always be maintained. The Great Wall of China was never conceived as a single continuous monument. It began as an idea born of fear, geography, and fragmentation. Long before China became one empire, it was a landscape of rival states, each guarding its borders against neighbors and nomadic raiders. These early defenses were modest, packed earth ramparts, trenches, wooden fences. But they established a pattern that would endure for centuries. The wall did not start as a symbol, it started as a reaction. In the northern plains, borders were fluid and vulnerable. Horse-mounted raiders could move faster than armies, striking deep and vanishing before retaliation arrived. Walls offered something armies could not: delay. Even a low embankment could slow horses, funnel movement, and give defenders time to respond. These early barriers were not meant to stop invasions outright, they were meant to shape them. Each state built independently with its own methods and priorities. Some walls followed ridge lines, others traced rivers or cut across open land. Materials were local and practical: rammed earth, reeds, gravel, timber. There was no uniform design because there was no shared vision. What unified these efforts was necessity. Defense had become architectural. When the state of Qin began its rise, conquering rivals and unifying territory, it inherited these fragments. Rather than dismantle them, Qin connected and expanded them. This was not done out of aesthetic ambition, it was a strategic decision. The northern frontier remained exposed, and the newly unified empire could not afford instability so soon after its creation. Walls that once divided Chinese states were repurposed to separate the empire from the steppe. This transformation marked a shift. The wall was no longer about local survival. It became an imperial boundary. Labor was mobilized on a scale previously unseen. Soldiers, conscripts, convicts, and peasants were sent north to reinforce, extend, and connect defenses. The work was brutal, often deadly and relentless. Yet the logic was clear. An empire needed edges. What emerged was not a single wall, but a system, a landscape engineered for defense. Watchtowers, signal fires, garrisons, and supply routes followed. The wall became infrastructure rather than architecture. It was built to be used, repaired, and rebuilt. By the time later generations spoke of the Great Wall, they were referring not to a moment of construction, but to a tradition of responding to threat with earth and stone. A tradition that would stretch across dynasties, centuries, and countless human lives. When Deccan State completed the unification of China, the wall entered a new phase, one defined by scale, speed, and human cost. Under Qin Shi Huang, defense was no longer a regional concern, it was an imperial obsession. The northern frontier represented the only direction from which the newly unified state could be seriously threatened, and Qin leadership responded with uncompromising force. The emperor ordered existing walls to be linked, reinforced, and extended into a continuous defensive line. This was not a symbolic project meant to inspire loyalty. It was a logistical command driven by fear of nomadic confederations beyond the steppe. Speed mattered more than comfort. Durability mattered more than lives. Labor was extracted on an unprecedented scale. Hundreds of thousands of people were sent north. Soldiers, peasants, prisoners, political enemies. Many were conscripted for years at a time. Families were broken apart. Villages lost their working populations. The wall rose not because the empire was rich in resources, but because it was ruthless in mobilizing bodies. Construction methods reflected urgency. Builders used rammed earth techniques, layering soil, gravel, and reeds into hardened masses. Stone was used where available, but earth dominated. The wall was shaped by the land itself, following ridges and choke points to maximize defensive advantage while minimizing material transport. This was not engineering elegance. It was enforced efficiency. Life on the wall was harsh. Workers faced extreme cold, hunger, exhaustion, and disease. Many died and were buried near the construction zones, giving rise to later legends that the wall was built at top human bones. While exaggerated, these stories captured a truth. The wall consumed lives as readily as it consumed earth. Second state justified this cost through ideology. The emperor ruled by absolute authority and individual suffering was considered irrelevant, next to imperial survival. The wall became a physical expression of that worldview. It was long, unyielding, and indifferent to those who built it. Ironically, the Qin dynasty itself was short-lived. Rebellion followed soon after the emperor's death, fueled in part by the very labor demands that made the wall possible. Yet the structure endured. Later dynasties inherited not only the wall's foundations, but its logic. Once an empire builds a boundary of this scale, it becomes difficult to abandon it. The Qin phase of the Great Wall set a precedent. It proved that the state could reshape geography through command alone. It also revealed the cost of doing so. From this point forward, the wall would never be just stone and earth. It would always be remembered as a monument built by power and paid for by people. After the fall of Second Dynasty, later rulers inherited a harsh lesson. Walls alone do not defend an empire. The early Qin fortifications had been impressive in scale, but they were brittle, without sustained support. Under the Han Dynasty, the Great Wall evolved from a blunt barrier into a living system, one designed to observe, communicate, and control space rather than simply obstruct it. The Han faced the same northern threats, particularly mobile steppe groups who could outmaneuver static defenses. Instead of relying solely on height and thickness, Han planners expanded the wall's supporting infrastructure. Watchtowers rose at regular intervals, positioned for long distance visibility. From these towers, soldiers scanned the horizon for movement, dust clouds, and smoke. Early warnings that mattered more than stone. In an age of cavalry warfare, signal systems became the wall's nervous system. Fires by night, smoke by day, and flags or drums in clear weather allowed messages to travel across vast distances with remarkable speed. A single sighting could trigger a chain of alerts stretching hundreds of miles, mobilizing garrisons long before an enemy reached settled land. In this way, the wall functioned less as a stopgap and more as an early warning network. Garrisons were integrated directly into the wall's structure. Soldiers lived along the frontier year-round, farming nearby land to sustain themselves. This reduced supply strain and anchored military presence permanently to the border. The wall became inhabited space, harsh, isolated, and disciplined. Life there was monotonous, punctuated by long silences and sudden alarms. The Han also used the wall to regulate movement. Gates and passes controlled trade, diplomacy, and migration. The wall did not seal China off completely, it filtered interaction. Merchants passed through checkpoints, envoys were monitored. Nomadic leaders negotiated at designated crossings. The wall thus became an instrument of policy shaping how China engaged with the outside world. This period marked a conceptual shift. The wall was no longer just defense. It was administration stretched across the landscape. It defined where imperial authority began and where it faded. By turning the wall into a system rather than a structure, the Han ensured its longevity. Stone could crumble, but networks endured. Observation, communication, and control transformed the Great Wall into something more subtle and far more effective than a mere line of fortification. The Great Wall did not grow steadily, it expanded and decayed in cycles, rising and falling with the fortunes of the dynasties that inherited it. After the Han period, imperial attention shifted inward. Civil wars, fragmentation, and changing political priorities meant that long stretches of the wall were abandoned to wind and erosion. Grass crept over ramparts, watchtowers collapsed. In many places, the wall returned quietly to the earth from which it had been raised. During periods of division, such as the centuries between the Han and the Tang, northern defense became a regional concern once again. Smaller states repaired local sections while ignoring others entirely. The wall fractured, mirroring the political landscape. What survived did so not because of centralized planning, but because certain frontier zones remained strategically useful. When reunification came under later dynasties, the wall re-entered imperial thinking but cautiously. Under the Sui dynasty, massive construction projects strained the population, and rulers learned from Qin history that excessive forced labor could destabilize the state. Will repair continued, but it was no longer pursued as a single monumental obsession. The Tang dynasty went even further. Confident in military strength and diplomatic engagement, Tang rulers relied less on walls and more on mobile armies, alliances, and forward control of frontier regions. In this era, the wall mattered less as a physical barrier and more as a symbolic boundary of older imperial strategies. Some sections were maintained, but many were left untouched for generations. This pattern reveals an important truth: the Great Wall was never inevitable. It expanded when rulers felt insecure and receded when they felt confident. It was not a constant shield, but a reflection of political psychology. Strong dynasties preferred flexibility, weaker ones preferred stone. Environmental forces continued their work regardless of imperial intention. Wind, rain, and freeze cycles reduced earth walls to low ridges. Only in areas where later dynasties rebuilt in stone did the wall retain visible form. Elsewhere it survived only in records, local memory, and legend. By this point, the wall had become something paradoxical. It was ancient yet unfinished, vast yet inconsistent, powerful in reputation yet uneven in reality. Each dynasty chose how much of it to inherit and how much to ignore. The Great Wall was not one decision repeated forever. It was a conversation across centuries between fear, confidence, and the limits of state power. The Great Wall reached its most recognizable form under the Ming dynasty. Not because the threat was new, but because the fear was renewed. After the collapse of the Mongol Yuan dynasty, the Ming rulers inherited an empire deeply scarred by foreign rule. The northern frontier, once governed from Beijing by steppe elites, was now a source of anxiety rather than expansion. For the Ming, the wall was no longer optional, it was a statement of separation. Unlike earlier dynasties that relied heavily on earthworks, the Ming rebuilt the wall in stone and brick. This was a deliberate shift. Stone endured where earth eroded. Brick resisted weather, time, and assault. The Ming wall was not meant to delay, it was meant to hold. Thick parapets, crenellations, and reinforced towers transformed the wall into a true fortress system. Construction was systematic and regionally adapted. In mountainous terrain, the wall followed ridge lines, merging with cliffs to become almost invisible from a distance. In flatter regions, it rose high and imposing with deep foundations to prevent collapse. Watchtowers were placed closer together, allowing tighter surveillance and faster response. Artillery platforms were integrated, reflecting the growing importance of gunpowder weapons. Life along the Ming Wall was rigidly organized. Soldiers were stationed permanently, often in hereditary military households. Their lives were defined by routine patrols, drills, maintenance, and long periods of waiting. The wall was not just a barrier, it was a workplace. Villages grew around garrisons, supplying food, labor, and replacements. The frontier became a managed zone rather than a wild edge. The Ming Wall also formalized border control. Passes were monumentalized, turning entry points into ceremonial gates as well as defensive choke points. Trade was permitted but regulated. Diplomacy occurred at controlled crossings. The wall did not isolate China completely. It curated contact, yet this massive investment revealed a strategic shift. The Ming chose defense over expansion. Rather than projecting power outward, they hardened the boundary inward. The wall became a psychological reassurance as much as a military asset. It said that the empire knew where it ended and intended to stay there. This version of the Great Wall is the one most remembered today, not because it was the first, but because it was the most complete expression of a long-held impulse to turn fear into architecture and permanence into stone. For most of its existence, the Great Wall was not experienced as a monument, but as a place of work. Thousands of soldiers lived along its length, often for their entire adult lives, guarding a frontier that was quiet far more often than it was violent. The popular image of constant battle is misleading. The reality was endurance, long stretches of boredom, isolation, and routine broken by brief moments of fear. Garrison life was highly regulated, especially during the Ming period. Soldiers followed strict schedules, patrols along assigned sections, maintenance of walls and towers, weapon drills, and signal practice. Every watchtower had defined responsibilities. Fires had to be prepared. Signal materials had to be kept dry. A moment of negligence could mean disaster if an alarm failed to travel. The wall demanded constant care, whether cracked brick and loosened stone. Wine filled crenellations with sand. Rain undermined foundations. Soldiers were builders as much as fighters. Much of their time was spent repairing what nature steadily tried to erase. Defense was not heroic, it was repetitive. Isolation weighed heavily. Garrisons were often far from cities and families. Some soldiers were stationed with wives and children, forming semi-permanent frontier communities. Others lived alone or among fellow soldiers, months from meaningful contact with the interior. Letters traveled slowly. Supplies were irregular. Winters were brutal. Actual combat, when it came, was fast and chaotic. Raiding parties tested weak points, probing rather than attacking outright. The wall rarely stopped invasions entirely, but it forced enemies to reveal themselves. Alarms bought time. Reinforcements could be mobilized. Most encounters ended in skirmishes rather than sieges. Importantly, the wall also shaped the psychology of defense. Soldiers were trained to watch rather than chase. Leaving the wall to pursue enemies was discouraged. The structure imposed restraint. It turned warfare into observation, signaling, and coordination rather than impulsive pursuit. In this way, the wall disciplined not just enemies, but defenders. For the men stationed there, loyalty was complicated. They defended the empire, but often felt distant from it. Their lives were consumed by maintenance and waiting, not glory. Yet without them, the wall was meaningless. Stone could not see, towers could not decide. The wall only worked because people endured its demands. This human layer is often forgotten. But the Great Wall was never just a line across the land. It was a lived environment, cold, exhausting, and repetitive, held together by soldiers whose names were rarely recorded, but whose presence made the entire system possible. Long after sections of the Great Wall crumbled or fell silent, stories filled the gaps. The wall became more than defense. It became a vessel for memory, grief, and meaning. For generations, people explained its scale not through policy or logistics, but through legend. Stone alone could not account for something so vast. Stories had to finish the work. The most enduring of these is the tale of Ming Jingyu, whose husband was taken to labor on the wall and never returned. According to legend, her grief was so powerful that it caused a section of the wall to collapse, revealing his bones. The story is not historical, but it survived because it expressed something true. The wall consumed lives, separated families, and demanded sacrifice from people who gained little in return. Myth gave those losses a voice. Such stories softened the wall's image while also condemning it. The wall became a symbol of state cruelty and human endurance at the same time. It was admired and feared, mourned and respected. In folklore, the wall listened, it remembered. It punished arrogance and rewarded devotion. These were moral frameworks applied to an inhuman structure. Poets and scholars added another layer. For them, the wall represented distance between center and frontier, ruler and soldier, civilization and wilderness. It appeared in verses as a place of exile, duty and longing. Opposing to the wall meant absence from home, years lost to silence. Even when no battle occurred, the emotional cost remained. Over time, the wall's meaning shifted again. As dynasties passed and threats changed, the wall stopped functioning as an active frontier in many regions. But it did not disappear from cultural memory. Instead, it hardened into symbol. It came to represent perseverance, unity, and historical continuity. Ideas that had little to do with its original purpose, but everything to do with how later generations needed to understand the past. This transformation matters. The Great Wall outlived the fears that built it by becoming something else entirely. It turned from military infrastructure into cultural inheritance. Its stones no longer warned of invasion, they warned of forgetting. In this way, the wall's greatest strength was not defensive. It was narrative, even broken, even abandoned. It continued to shape how people understood power, suffering, and time. The empire that built it vanished, the stories did not. And so the wall endured, not only across the land, but across imagination. For all its scale and symbolism, the Great Wall was never an impenetrable shield. It was a tool effective under certain conditions, fragile unders. Its greatest weakness was not height or thickness, but dependence. The wall only worked when the state behind it was strong, coordinated, and willing to sustain it. When those conditions faltered, stone offered little protection. By the late imperial period, especially under Thekking dynasty, the wall's strategic value diminished sharply. Thekking rulers themselves originated from beyond the wall. They did not conquer China by smashing through fortifications, but by passing through gates opened by political collapse, corruption, and betrayal. The lesson was brutal and clear. Walls do not stop enemies invited inside. Even earlier, nomadic forces had repeatedly bypassed or neutralized the wall. They bribed guards, exploited poorly defended passes, or simply went around unfinished sections. The wall was strongest where the state was present, and weakest where attention waned. In times of famine, rebellion, or fiscal strain, maintenance collapsed, towers emptied, signals failed. The wall remained, but it was hollow. This exposed a deeper truth. The Great Wall was never a substitute for diplomacy, military readiness, or internal stability. It amplified strength, but could not replace it. When the court was unified and responsive, the wall functioned as intended, delaying attacks, buying time, and shaping engagement. When the court fractured, the wall became a long reminder of lost control. By the 18th and 19th centuries, advances in warfare further eroded its usefulness. Artillery could breach stone. Modern logistics allowed armies to move around static defenses. The wall became obsolete, not through destruction, but through irrelevance. It was still there, but it no longer decided outcomes. And yet, failure did not erase meaning. The wall's inability to protect Thekking did not diminish its historical weight. Instead, it reframed it. The Great Wall came to symbolize the limits of defensive thinking. The idea that security could be achieved through barriers alone. History suggested otherwise. Empires that relied heavily on walls often did so when confidence was already slipping. The wall was a response to fear, not a cure for it. Its failures were not architectural, they were political. In this sense, the Great Wall's collapse, a defensive solution, was also its final lesson. Power does not endure because it builds higher walls. It endures because it manages people, resources, and legitimacy. When those fail, even the longest wall in the world becomes just another road for history to walk across. By the time the Great Wall ceased to function as a meaningful military system, it had already transformed into something far larger than its original purpose. What remained was not a defensive line, but a historical presence, stretching across mountains, deserts, and memory. The wall no longer defined where danger began, it defined where history had passed. What makes the Great Wall remarkable is not that it worked perfectly, but that it was attempted at all. Few states in human history tried to hold geography itself in place for centuries. The wall represents an ongoing argument between land and authority, between movement and control. Each dynasty that repaired or extended it believed briefly that permanence could be engineered. In reality, the wall never froze the world outside it. Cultures crossed it, armies crossed it, ideas crossed it. What the wall did was slow, channel, and record those crossings. It left scars on the landscape where politics met terrain. Those scars are still visible today. Over time, the meaning of the wall inverted. What began as a boundary between inside and outside became a symbol of collective identity. The wall came to represent endurance, continuity, and scale, qualities valued by later generations far removed from the fears that built it. Tourism replaced patrols, photography replaced watchfires. The wall shifted from instrument to inheritance. This transformation also softened its brutality. The forced labor, deaths, and suffering that made the wall possible faded into abstraction. Stone remained, names did not. The wall became admirable partly because its cost was no longer visible. That distance is uncomfortable. But honest monuments often survive because their human price does not. And yet the wall still teaches. It teaches that states respond to insecurity with construction, that fear can be poured into architecture, that power often prefers solidity over flexibility, even when flexibility would serve it better. The wall shows both ambition and limitation in the same line of stone. In the end, the Great Wall did not protect China forever, but it did something rarer. It preserved a record of how long an empire tried. It marks centuries of decision, labor, and belief layered one atop another. The wall stretches on, broken and whole at the same time. No longer guarding an empire, it guards a question instead: how far humans will go to feel secure and what they leave behind when security proves temporary.